Good evening and welcome to everybody. Welcome to our regulars, and if you're a first timer this week, welcome to you too. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am again your MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, David Matlow, who we will introduce formally in a moment. And tonight's topic is a very interesting one. It's all about Theodore Herzl. David's going to deliver a presentation for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll open up as usual to questions from the audience. So just in case you're not familiar with the process, what we ask you to do is raise your hand electronically, and you can do that via the participants button or the reactions button along the bottom. That comes up on our screen, and then we put you in line and we'll ask you to get to your question in turn. The chat function is always available again, and as always, we do ask people to stick to the topic. And you'll see on the chat function, I've put some links up there at the very top. David will talk about those during his presentation, but if ever you need to come back and look at them, that's where they're going to be. So Theodore Herzl, who lived from 1860 to 1904, was of course the visionary who initiated the process that led to the birth of the State of Israel in 1948. His dream was not only about having a land for the Jewish people, but of building a model society within that land. Israel has now been in existence and thrived for 73 years. So why is Herzl still important? After more than 100 years after his death, can Theodore Herzl be some sort of role model for us in this modern and very different age that we live in? Well, we're going to find out from David Matlow, who is a partner at a Toronto law firm and who has assembled the world's largest collection of Herzl memorabilia. He started his collection in 1991 when he became interested in the historical figure of Herzl himself. David's collection is comprised of approximately 5,000 artifacts, which includes an extensive assortment of photographs, postcards, keychains, wrappers from sardine cans, and of course photo albums with Herzl on the cover. Together with Canada's Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs, David tells Herzl's story in a 6-part series of 3-minute videos called Herzl Explained, which can all be seen online, and those links are the ones I referred to up on the chat function for those who are interested, so you can look at those anytime. David speaks regularly to schools, synagogues and other groups about Herzl, and we're delighted to have him join us tonight. David, good morning to you in Toronto, Canada, where it's just gone 6 a.m, and welcome to Australia via our Zoom session.
Thank you very much, Alan, and hello, Australia. Good evening, everyone. It's breakfast with Herzl here in Canada. I do appreciate everyone tuning in to this presentation. I'm going to screen share now because through this presentation I will show you some artifacts in my collection and tell Herzl's story through those artifacts. So, can you see that?
Yes, that's all good, David.
Fantastic. So my presentation is called Collecting the Dream. And as I say, I collect the dream. The dream, of course, is a Jewish state, a state for the Jewish people. And the dreamer in chief was Theodore Herzl. He had this vision, which we will talk about, which all of you, I'm sure, know about, for the creation of the Jewish state, the state of Israel, which we are now have the miraculous opportunity to live at a time where this Jewish state exists. And in this presentation, I'll tell you a little bit about Herzl as seen through artifacts in my collection. I will explain a bit how the collection was put together. Most importantly, what the purpose is. Why is he relevant? What can we learn? How can knowing about Herzl change our life? And give a few examples of that. And as Alan mentioned, there'll be time for questions at the end. At the outset, just want to recognize that we're living in a period of the coronavirus. I understand in Melbourne, My daughter was in Australia for a semester, so she said it's Melbourne, but that there is some difficulty with the coronavirus. We here in Ontario, Canada, we're just coming out of the emergency and beginning to resume slowly our normal lives. So I hope everyone is well and gets through this. There is, in my mind, a connection between what we're experiencing in the virus period and the dream of Herzl. Here in Ontario, we've been told to shelter at home at 3 different phases during the emergency, because it's at home that we can be safe. And that's what Herzl wanted for the Jewish people, a home where we can be safe. And so hopefully everyone will get through this healthy and well. This is me when I'm 5 years old, and Alan said I became interested in the early 90s, which is true from a collecting point of view, but I have been interested in Herzl since I was a kid. And I know it's weird to be an 8 or a 10-year-old boy and be interested in Theodore Herzl. And I don't know whether it started at this moment. This is me and my sister, who now lives in Israel, on Har Herzl in 1966. And this was at a time where Jerusalem was divided. My grandparents had moved to Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, in the 50s. They were born in Mulch in Belarus, came to Toronto, lived their lives, started businesses, had children, including my father, but their dream was to live in the state of Israel. And when it was created, they just up and moved, and we would go visit them in the summertime. And we obviously took a day trip to Jerusalem. It was the divided city, as I said, and this signifies the fact that we went to Mount Herzl, that this was an important person to my parents too. So this perhaps is where it all started. And this is the first item in my collection. This was in my grandparents' home in Ramat Gan. And when my grandmother died in 1991, I asked for this picture. It was framed in her living room in a very important spot, in a very regal frame. And when we moved it or shipped it to Toronto, we had to reframe it. And I learned that what this was a free giveaway in the Haaretz newspaper in 1960 on the occasion of Herzl's 100th birthday. But nevertheless, although it was free, my grandparents framed it because he was such a significant person. They were living in the country that he envisioned. I often, when I speak to American audiences, and I do a lot of presentations to communities in the United States and Canada, I'd like to show something that connects Herzl with their country. And there are a lot of examples of Herzl and the U.S. flag because of the obviously the importance that Herzl saw in the future of the Zionist enterprise coming from the United States, but also shared values in terms of democracy and freedom. So I took some time to see, do I have any Herzl artifact tied to Australia? And I was able to find one, which is this, which I think was published on it's a souvenir sheet of stamps that must have been published perhaps by the Australian Zionist Federation or some organization on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Herzl's birth, I believe, so which would be in 2010. And so this is my Australian-related Herzl item. As you heard, I have 5,000 items, and Alan summarized some of them. So this must mean that Herzl was an extremely important person, that people bothered to make so many items with his likeness. He was so important that not one, but 2 brands of sardines were named after Herzl. And you'll see on the left is an ad for Portuguese sardines that were sold in Eretz Israel and in Palestine in the 1930s. This was the winner of a prize at the 1934 Levant Fair. And to the right, a label for a brand of sardines that was sold in the United States from sardines that came from Norway. And I often wonder to myself about the meeting of the advertising executives for these sardine companies. And they're sitting around and asking themselves, what should we name these sardines in order to encourage people to buy them? And that someone put their hand up and said, I know, let's put Theodore Herzl on the label of the sardines to encourage people to buy these salty fish. And some people would look at this and say, though, this is not dignified. Here you can see Herzl in a tuxedo in both these pictures. It's not dignified for Herzl, but I see it a different way. That Herzl was so important after his passing, which we'll talk about, that people were looking for ways to keep his name, his likeness, and his dream alive. And to do that through selling sardines is a little bit odd, but I see it more respectful than disrespectful. A little bit of history about Herzl. He was born in 1860 in Budapest, Hungary. He moved to Vienna when he was a teenager. And at the time, Vienna was a major center of culture in Europe. Herzl experienced anti-Semitism in his lifetime. There is this myth about Herzl that he didn't really know about his Jewishness. He didn't understand anti-Semitism until he covered the Dreyfus trial, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that's historically not the case. He struggled with the issue of anti-Semitism for much of his adult life. He was in a fraternity that turned anti-Semitic, and he, as a result of which he quit. He resigned from the fraternity. He was a lawyer like me, but unlike me, he stopped practicing law. He wanted to be a judge, and in Austria at the time, Jews couldn't be judges. And then he became a playwright. And to the left is a play that he wrote, which was finished in 1894. It's called The New Ghetto. It was performed with middling success in Austrian Viennese theater. But The New Ghetto is the glass ceiling, or really a glass cube, that Jews experienced in Europe. They were not able to integrate fully into the regular life in Europe, and that was the new ghetto. And this was a reflection of Herzl's struggle with the issue of anti-Semitism and long looking for different solutions for it. He was not the greatest of playwrights, and then he became a journalist and got the opportunity to work for a prominent Viennese newspaper called the Neue Freie Presse. So top right is his business card, and he then in this position became the correspondent for this newspaper in Paris. And so bottom right is a letter that was sent to him in Paris. I don't know if it included his paycheck. By the time this envelope came to me, it was empty. So I just have the envelope, and if there was a check in it, I hope that he cashed it. As the Paris correspondent for this newspaper in 1894 and 1895, so remember he's born in 1860, so he's 34 years old, he covered the Dreyfus trial. The Dreyfus, and this was in Paris. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army who was wrongfully charged with espionage, giving state secrets to the Germans. And this became a huge cause célèbre, a big show trial in Paris. And because this was a Jewish officer and raised all the issues of whether Jewish people are loyal to their country where they live, or do they have dual loyalties? Are they not to be trusted? And so anti-Semitism, which clearly was bubbling below the surface of European society, percolated to the top, where there was great anti-Semitism and cries of either, and there's a dispute about this outside the courthouse, were there cries of death to Judas or death to the Jews? But in any event, there was tremendous anti-Semitism percolating to the forefront. And I must say, it feels no different than what's being experienced on Toronto, Canada now. I don't know whether in Australia there has been a rise in anti-Semitism after the incidents, after the conflict with Gaza, with the Hamas last month, but certainly in Canada we are feeling it. It didn't create it; it just opened up the door for anti-Semitism to rise up. So probably a similar experience that Herzl was witnessing. Dreyfus ultimately was convicted. This is some magazines and postcards with Dreyfus telling the Dreyfus story. He was convicted, and the bottom right is a center spread from a magazine through his degrading ceremony, where his epaulets were sliced off of his uniform, his sword was snapped, and he went off to prison. Ultimately, there was a retrial, and he was acquitted. But this alarmed Herzl greatly, and he then sequestered himself in his hotel room. He stayed at the Hotel Castile, which is in Paris. And wouldn't you know it, when my wife and I went to Paris, we just happened to stay at the Hotel Castile as we followed the footsteps of Herzl around the world. And in the Hotel Castile, there's a plaque on the street. It's in Hebrew, but it says that in this hotel, Herzl wrote Medinat HaYehudim, his book, The Jewish State. So here it is on the left, the Judenstaat, in English, a Jewish state. And this was Herzl's, and this was published in February of 1896. So we just celebrated a few months ago the 125th anniversary of the publishing of this book. And in this book, Herzl articulated his solution to the anti-Semitism that he was experiencing and deathly worried about. And you can see in English in the top right, the subtitle is An Attempt at a Modern Solution of the Jewish Question. The Jewish question is anti-Semitism, and his solution was that we should have a Jewish state. In this book, he didn't articulate with finality where that Jewish state should be. Could have been Argentina, it could have been in Palestine, but that was the idea. And it was really a blueprint of how to do it, the mechanics of doing it, and what legal right there is to do it, and a little bit, how the state would be set up. It's a primer, it's a roadmap. And Herzl launched this book out into the world, and he didn't. Although he was Jewish, as I mentioned, and experienced anti-Semitism, he really was not knowledgeable about the Jewish world. So when he wrote this book, he thought he came up with this idea, because he just wasn't well read and didn't hang out with the other Jewish leaders. But of course, the idea of returning to Eretz Yisrael is something that we have dreamed about since we were expelled from it in 70 AD. And next year in Jerusalem, we say at the Passover Seder, and there were thinkers and leaders before him. Pinsker and Moshe Hess and the Chovevei Tzion lovers of Zion had this idea. Herzl didn't know about them, but the difference, the distinguishing feature for Herzl is he went out and did something about it. And that's a life lesson we'll talk about in a bit. It's what Herzl, instead of fetching that there was a problem or wishing someone would do something about it, he actually did something about it. And that's why, even though he didn't come up with the idea, in my view, that's why Herzl is acknowledged to be the visionary of the state of Israel, because it's dreams coupled with action that has results. So what did he do? He began to talk about his plan, and this was in July 1896. It's a flyer, a handbill. It's probably 4 inches by 8 inches. I know we have metric in Canada, but I still think in inches. It's a small flyer about a a presentation that he was going to make in London, England. This is his first speaking tour on the subject of his idea. And the greatest next thing he did was to convene a Zionist Congress. This is in 1897. It took place in August. So we're talking about 16 months after he published the Judenstaat. So imagine in the late 1800s being able to identify the Zionists, or people who were partial to the idea of a Jewish homeland, communicate with them, and encourage them to come to this first ever Congress in Basel, Switzerland. It was initially supposed to be in Munich, but the rabbis in Munich didn't want this Congress there. To some, the idea of Zionism was heresy, that for the religious people, that it's for Hashem, it's not for man, it's for God to take us back in the time of the Messiah to Eretz Israel. For certain Western Europeans who had made it in Western society, they said this is a terrible idea. We've worked for 100 years to be able to prove that we can be part of the West of our country, and you're saying it's impossible, we've got to go. So there was a lot of conflict, a lot of difficulty, but in any event, through it all, he convened the first Zionist Congress. And Herzl I think he was a genius in so many ways, and he understood that we need to imprint in people's minds what this idea would look like. It's a brand new idea. So there were a lot of images and postcards and souvenirs, or as our kids would say, at least here, swag items for conferences. So there was this postcards, this from the first Zionist Congress, and you can see on the left there are people praying at the Kotel, the Western Wall, and on the right, a farmer planting his field. And every Zionist Congress had postcards. This is also an image, a famous image from the first Zionist Congress. It's a little crumply because it's on an old postcard, but this is a composite picture of those who were in attendance at the first Zionist Congress. The largest picture in the middle is, of course, Herzl and the various delegates. And Herzl insisted that everyone who attended the Congress wear the equivalent of a tuxedo. Because, as my mother used to say, if you want to be taken seriously, you should dress seriously. And so he made everyone wear formal dress because he was using his skills as a dramatist, as a lawyer. He threw all those skills at this. So this was street theater. He knew there would be photographs, and he wanted photographs to show serious people doing serious business. And though it's hard to tell, the bottom row is women who were attendees at the first Zionist Congress. Zionism was a very progressive idea in its time, and frankly, in this time too. In the first Zionist Congress, women were observers, non-voting observers. By the second Zionist Congress, which was 1 year later in 1898, women were full voting members of the Zionist Congress. And at the time, the only country in the world that gave women equal rights, equal voting rights, was New Zealand. Voting in Canada for women in 1918, in the United States in 1920. I don't know when it was in Australia, but this is reflective of the progressive nature of Zionism as Herzl envisioned it. At the fifth Zionist Congress in 1901, the Keren Kayemet L'Israel, the Jewish National Fund, was established. This was to buy land in Palestine and Eretz Israel, to cultivate the land, and this is reflective of Herzl wanting to, again, not just dream or talk, but create the infrastructure of a state in creation. The Zionist Congress was effectively the parliament, and Herzl said, most people have a country, then have a parliament. We have a parliament first, then we'll have a country. And this organization, the Keren Kayemet Jewish National Fund, to buy land and begin to cultivate the land that would become the state of Israel. Israel is the only country in the world that had more trees at the end of the 20th century than it did at the beginning of the 20th century, in part because of this initiative, which was the effort of Jews from around the world. Penny and the Pushka, every week, pennies and pennies and dunam by dunam to be able to purchase and cultivate the land. And because this was adopted at the Fifth Zionist Congress, there are many images of Herzl connected to trees. The other important piece of infrastructure that Herzl created was something called the Jewish Colonial Trust, which was chartered under the laws of England in 1899, intended to almost be an investment house to raise capital and invest in cities, developments, initiatives, businesses in Eretz Israel. And there were shares of the Jewish Colonial Trust sold around the world. My great-grandparents who lived in Belarus bought shares of this company, and the shares cost the equivalent of £1 and shares were bought on installments, so you would get a sticker. The sticker on the left is from England, on the right is from Canada, and the postcard on the bottom right is from the United States that your second installment is due. And hundreds of thousands of Jews from around the world purchased shares. And the Jewish Colonial Trust established a subsidiary, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, which was a bank that had branches in Jerusalem and in Jaffa and in Tiberias and actually in Beirut and in Gaza, that took deposits and loaned money towards the building of the infrastructure. The land that is now Tel Aviv was purchased with a loan from the Jewish Colonial Trust. And as I mentioned, shares were sold to hundreds of thousands of Jews from around the world. And this is something that happened in January of this year. I bought a collection of share certificates, and in the collection was one for the Jewish Colonial Trust, owned by registered in the name of a woman named Sadie Weiss, who lived in Monticello, New York. Monticello, New York is in the Catskills, not very far from here. I used to go to the Catskills as a kid, so this kind of intrigued me, Monticello. So I took upon myself as a project to see if there were any descendants of Sadie Weiss who were alive, if I could find them, and I'll return the share certificate as a way to connect her descendants with a dream that this woman had in 1923 as a supporter of Herzl's dream. So I ended up finding this gentleman, Marty Weiss, who lives in San Diego, and I returned the share certificate to him, and this became known to a reporter out in California. So she wrote the story, which then went into syndication and was in a number of newspapers around the world. But it was a way to talk about Herzl and his dream for a Jewish state in a kind of nice story. There is a website maintained by the the government trustee in Israel, where you can put in your name or a town where your parents or grandparents came from to see if they're on the registered list of shareholders. And that's how we knew our great-grandparents were shareholders. This Sadie Weiss's name is on that list, and I have given Alan the link if anyone is interested in finding out whether their ancestors might have been shareholders of this company. There's a way to do it. I went in to see if there's any registered shareholder in Australia. There is not, but maybe a number of generations ago, if your ancestors were in Europe before they came to Australia. Just an example of some of the items in my collection. On the left is a postcard of Herzl. This is a famous image of him on the balcony of the Three Kings Hotel in Basel, Switzerland. And wouldn't you know it, that I actually stayed at the Three Kings Hotel in Basel. They have a room, Herzl room, there where they know that Herzl was there. They know at the hotel that it's significant in the history of the Jewish people. And if you take a look at this postcard, you'll see Herzl signed this card. That's his signature, Herzl, under it, which means he was like a rock star, superstar. People would go up to him and ask for his autograph, for him to sign his own picture. Items on the right, an election-style pin, the back of a stopwatch with Herzl, the same image of him on the balcony. This is Herzl in a bottle. I have no idea what this is, where it's from, what it's for, but there it is. And some other items. It just gives an example of how important he was, that he was on such a range of items. Czechoslovakian glass goblet on the left, the bottom right, a Russian version of the Hatikva, and on the top right, this was a Karen Heisod sacrifice bond. It's about 100 years old, and Herzl's image on it, and this was to raise funds for infrastructure in Israel. And this, I say, is more sacrifice than bond, because the small print in italics says, what you've really done is give a donation. You're not going to get the money back. And this is the prized jewel in my collection. It's a little autograph book that was worn on a locket, and it was signed by the prominent Zionists at the time. And this is Benjamin, is Herzl, his Hebrew name, Binyamin Zev Herzl. It's rare for him to sign as Benjamin, but that is him. In 1902, Herzl wrote his second of two books, Alt Neuland, Old New Land, which is, if the Jewish state was really a primer of how to get a state, this book is a utopian description of what that Jewish state would look like 20 years in the future. It was written in 1902, and he's talking about the new society, the Jewish state in 1923. And it's quite fascinating what he envisioned and how some of those things are consistent with Israel today. A thriving democracy. Well, 5 elections in 2 years may be too thriving of a democracy, but certainly a thriving democracy. Electronic cars, telegraphic newspapers, which he envisioned as, I think, radio, but we might see it as the internet. Freedom of the press, communal farming, the importance of science, the importance of culture. This book, Old New Land, was translated very quickly into a number of languages, and in Hebrew, it was translated as Tel Aviv. A tel is an archaeological site of many layers, so that's old. Aviv is spring, so that's the old and the new. And the city of Tel Aviv is named after this book, which is also referenced, the word is referenced in the Tanakh, but the city of Tel Aviv, which was formed in 1909, is named after this book. Herzl died in 1904. He was 44 years old when he died. He wrote The Jewish State in 1896, so he dedicated the last 8 years of his life to the cause of Zionism. And so everything that he did on the theme of Zionism was in a short period of time. But his death was a surprise and a huge tragedy for the Jewish people. So this is the Die Welt, is the newspaper that he was the publisher of. He funded, and that's the cover that announces his death. And just as a reflection of his importance, on the right is the program from a memorial meeting held at Carnegie Hall in New York 2 weeks after his death. Herzl essentially bankrupted his family through the Zionist initiative. His wife was a wealthy heiress of a shipping tycoon, but he essentially spent all their money on the postcards, on the meetings, on traveling around Europe. He went to Palestine once. He never made it to North America or to Australia, but by the time he died, his family was bereft. He had 3 children who were teenagers at the time, and shortly after Herzl's death, there was a request to create a fund to look after Herzl's children. That's how bereft they were, and all suffered very tragic deaths. Herzl's wife, Julie, died within about 5 years, so the kids were orphans. The oldest daughter, Trude, became a drug addict and died in the 30s. His son, Hans, suffered from some emotional mental issues and committed suicide to be buried beside his sister. They were buried initially in Bordeaux, France. And the daughter, Trude, was married, but she died in Theresienstadt. She and her husband got their child out of Europe before the war. He was in Washington, in the working at the British Embassy, and when he learned after the war that his whole family perished, he committed suicide. So there's suicidality, or he died by suicide. There's suicidality issues in Herzl's family, and Herzl is the father of a nation but has no descendants. Herzl wrote in his diary after the First Zionist Congress in 1897, "In Basel, I created the Jewish state." And if I said that out loud now, people would think I'm crazy, but maybe in 5 years, and certainly in 50 years, people will know that I am right. And what you have in front of you is the invitation to the Declaration of Independence ceremony, which took place on May 14th, 1948 in Tel Aviv for the creation of the State of Israel, which was 50 years and about 7 months after Herzl wrote those words. And David, this is a drawing of the famous image you'll all be familiar with. This is David Ben-Gurion reading the Declaration of Independence under a portrait of Herzl, connecting the realization of Herzl's dream with the visionary. Herzl wrote in his will that when the Jewish state is created, he would want to be reburied there. And this happened in August of 1949. And it was a historic day for the new state. On the left is Herzl lying in state on the beach in Tel Aviv. And in the bottom right, this is him, the canopy that was above his gravestone, or his grave, when he was reburied in Mount Herzl, where the picture of me that you saw earlier was taken 11 years later, and 17 years later. And annually, Israel marks the beginning of its Independence Day with a ceremony on Mount Herzl, always connecting Herzl's vision with its realization. After the creation of the State of Israel, there was a whole new revival of Herzl items for my collection. So this is a record album, a cover of a record album. When I have a discussion with teenagers, I have to explain to them what a record album was. But this is Herzl on the cover for Israeli Disco. There was a ship in the Tzim line. It was a passenger ship, the SS Theodore Herzl. And I have, as you heard, thousands of items. The collection was built through piece by piece, through auctions on eBay, but also I'm pretty prominent as a collector, and from time to time I get a call from someone who wants to sell their collection. So I'm 60 years old, so I am not young by any means, but in the world of Herzl collecting, I am extremely young. And so I have the opportunity to buy collections as well. So that's why I've been able to assemble a collection. At the last count, it was 5,000. I frankly don't know how many pieces there are anymore. So you may be saying, okay, that's fantastic, David. You have all this stuff and you like to talk about it, and he's an interesting person, but what's the point? Why is he relevant? What difference does it make? And so I'll suggest to you there are 4 important lessons from Herzl. Where did Israel come from? There is just a lack of knowledge of where Israel came from. It didn't fall out of the sky in 1948. If you roll back the clock, you can roll it back to 70 AD from the Roman expulsion, but at least 50 years, the work, the planning, and the creation of the infrastructure to enable the Jewish state to be created in 1948. Herzl's motto, Im tirtzu ein so agada, anything is possible. If you will it, it is no dream. And so the idea of creating a Jewish state when Herzl was doing his work was an impossible dream, and it happened. And so this is true in our personal lives. Anything that we want badly enough, we can make happen. And also when we look at Israel, if we say it's impossible that there could be peace, and anything is possible. That's Herzl's motto. What Herzl did, he used his skills and talents to help the causes he cared about, to help the Jewish people, to assure a better future. And so we're all charged to be a little bit like Herzl and to use our talents for those purposes. And lastly, that Herzl's dream has been fulfilled but not completed. As you heard from Alan, Herzl's view was not that the goal of Zionism is not simply a Jewish state, but to build a model society in that land. And that work is ongoing. It will always be ongoing, and a model society will mean something different to all of us. But we're charged by learning about Herzl to try and be a bit like him and help to use our skills and talents to help complete Herzl's dream. So I have this discussion as part of what I call the Herzl Project. I'll move through this quickly so we'll have an opportunity to answer questions. So the Herzl Project is this a documentary film that I did and a book that I did, which is all available on my website for free viewing, herzlcollection.com. You can see a PDF of this book. You can watch the movie. It's on Vimeo, but the password is there. The 6-part series that Alan mentioned is there, and various other videos and articles about the collection, as well as a column that I have in the Canadian Jewish News called Treasure Trove, where every week I take an item from my collection, not Herzl, and talk about its relevance to build the story of the longing and the love of the Jewish people for the state of Israel. Part of my project was to create this mascot, which I call Theo. And Theo has been to a number of places, baseball parks, Times Square in New York City. That's him with former Ambassador Dermer at the Hanukkah party at the U.S. Israeli Embassy in Washington, in Las Vegas, in New York, in a parade. These are just different ways to have an opportunity to discuss Herzl. And the last vignette I'll share is a story about a school in Chicago named after Herzl. It's in North Lawndale, which is in western Chicago, was built at a time when that area was a Jewish area, and the local Zionists asked for a public school to be named after Herzl, which took place in 1915. And in that intervening 100 years, the population changed. It's now a Black community, but they view Herzl as a role model for them, that Herzl can inspire everyone to dream of a better future. So I visited there a number of times. I have helped to organize programs between the Jewish community and the community of North Lawndale to bring the communities together to talk about what we share is more than what separates us, a longing for a better future for all people. And on one of the visits, the principal said that her dream was to have a portrait of Herzl in the auditorium. And my wife was with me on that trip, and she said, "That's fantastic. If I can get another piece of junk out of the house, that would be amazing." So this portrait was dedicated in the auditorium, and it sits in the auditorium at that school. Herzl is on one wall, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s portrait is on the other wall. And they view them similarly, different but similarly. And as a result of this initiative, a synagogue in Skokie essentially adopted the school and annually buys Christmas gifts for all of the students. It's been on ABC TV for a number of years. Again, making connections between communities in Herzl's name. And I believe Herzl would be proud that through the lucky coincidence of this school being named after Herzl, links are being forged among communities. And lastly, what would Herzl do? This is in my my friends, everyone around Toronto has heard me talk about Herzl, and from time to time I get a call or an email saying, I was faced with a decision. Should I take this job? Should I start this project? Should I do this initiative? And they say, David, I remembered your talk, and you always said that it's about coupling dreams with action. So what would Herzl do if ever faced with a decision? Herzl would take action. He would try it. He would do something. And that's the inspiration I draw from Herzl. I always ask myself, what would Herzl do when I'm faced with a decision? And inevitably, I decide to take action and not just sit around and lament or kvetch or whine that something isn't the way it should. So this is the last item is Herzl playing hockey. It's a hockey bobblehead which I created. Herzl didn't know anything about hockey. He didn't care about hockey, may not even have heard about it. So you may be asking, why is there a Herzl hockey bobblehead? In Canada, if you want to get someone's interest, just connect it to hockey. And so that's why I created this item. I'm now, I will unscreen share and I'll be thrilled to answer any questions. If there were questions during the chat, I have not been able to see them. So maybe Alan or someone can help me read them. I will stop share.
David, thank you. Thank you very, very much. It's absolutely fascinating. I've just got one quick question for me, and then we'll go to Gary, Leon, Ron, and Saul. David, did Theodore Herzl have the support of the local Jewish community with all of this, or was he a bit of a loner, or regarded perhaps as a bit of a bit of an eccentric that was dreaming crazy dreams? Or was he really sort of spurred on by the local community?
Well, that's an excellent question. When he initially wrote the Judenstadt, he took it to a friend of his to read, and the friend burst out crying. And Herzl said, wow, I really touched it, said to himself, I really touched a chord here, right? Obviously, this is something very moving and meaningful for his friend. And the friend explained, no, I'm crying because I think you've gone crazy. I'm worried for your health. So there were people who thought this was a terrible idea, but it was most attractive in Eastern Europe, in Russia. And I picture Anatevka in Fiddler on the Roof, where living under the thumb of the police commissioner, and a pogrom can erupt at any time. And this was a solution. And so you hear about Chaim Weizmann, who ultimately became the first president of the state of Israel, read this, and like he was hit with by lightning. It really changed his life. So as I mentioned, he couldn't have the first Zionist Congress in Munich because the local rabbis, he called them the protest rabbis, petitioned the local town authority not to give them a permit because they thought this was such a bad idea. But the reform movement, American religious reform movement at the outset, said, no, thank you. Like, we have found our golden land here in America. We don't need your Jewish state. But over time, it resonated more and more, and it grew. As there is now, many different views on what the future of the Jewish people should be. And there was always a blank Zionism, labor Zionism, revisionist Zionism, communist Zionism, religious Zionism. And so ultimately it started to congeal different views about what the Jewish state should look like. But even to this day, there are members of the Jewish community who think this is not a good idea, or worse. And so the same was in Herzl's life. But he was able to assemble groups of his supporters. The first Congress had 225 people. It grew to 500-600 people. There ultimately were hundreds of thousands of members of Zionist organizations. So he created this infrastructure, but it was never 100% approved or ratified by the Jewish community. Nothing's ever 100%.
No, well, we know why with our community. Okay, Gary, you're first. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
I found in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1894 in February, the Jewish, what was it called? The Anglo-Jewish Association meeting, the AGM, where a Christian is saying, hang on, I'll just read the quote. Hang on, where is it? Sorry. There are 10 million Jews throughout the world, a people without a land, and there is Palestine without a people. This is 1894, early 1894, almost a year before the Dreyfus affair, 2 years before Herzl's Judenstaat, and it dates back to also Manasseh ben Israel with his reinstatement of Jews in Israel, in Britain, in the 1860s, where it crossed paths with the messianic ideas of Christianity and Judaism. How much does this have an interplay with Herzl's part in the creation of Israel?
It's an excellent question.
Thinking of the British lineage leading to the Balfour Declaration compared to Herzl's lineage leading to the spirit within Judaism.
Right.
How's that for?
It's a great question. Herzl would not have known about that organization and the work in the 1890s or any of that. As I said, he thought that he invented it. And so that had no influence on him. They say that after he discovered after he came up with Zionism, he discovered the Zionists who were already there. But Herzl, on the subject of British influence, Herzl understood that the Ottoman Empire, which was the controlling entity for Palestine at the time, right, the sick man of Europe, was crumbling, and he saw in England the future salvation of that land, and he cultivated relationships with England. The Fourth Zionist Congress in 1900 was in London, England, purposely to bring the issue onto English soil. He cultivated relationships with people that resulted in, and I didn't touch upon it, the offer in 1903 by the British government to have a Jewish presence, protectorate, whatever it might have been, what was called Uganda, but it's really Kenya. And all of that are the antecedents, because the same players had different positions 14 years later with the Balfour Declaration. So Herzl was, as I said, very smart. He cultivated relationships with Britain going forward, but he would have been unaware at the beginning of the organization that you mentioned, and all of the work and effort. And even I think Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, was in Palestine too, and said something consistent with what you just read. And people will dispute the accuracy of that there were no people there, but that's a discussion for another day. But in the short answer is Herzl would have had none of that, no idea of that, but he learned about all these people once he launched his book. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thanks. We've got a couple of people there. We might not get to everybody, but Leon, you are next. So Leon doesn't have a camera, so please unmute yourself and ask your question, Leon.
Good evening, David. Can you hear me?
I can, Leon.
From your lecture, it seems that Herzl's sole rationale for advocating the reconstitution of a Jewish state was that it be a refuge from anti-Semitism. Did Herzl ever articulate the view that a Jewish state, or the reconstitution of a Jewish state, was the natural right of the Jewish nation for a sovereign state, where it could effect a national renaissance, and it would be essential for the preservation of the Jewish nation's specific identity and its civilization and its heritage?
Not as articulated as well as you just said so, but yes, he did state that the Jewish people were one nation. The idea of the Jewish people being a nation, which most of us would take as second nature now, was an innovation in the late 1800s. The Jew was a religion, a civilization, whatever it might be, but as a nation, he said, we are one nation. And as one nation, we are entitled, just like the French and the Germans and the Greeks, to our own country. There was a lot of debate at the Congresses as to, do we need a state, do we need a homeland, or do we need a place where Jewish culture would emanate? And there was Martin Buber and the cultural Zionists, Achad Ha'am. There was lots of fighting, lots of debate. But it first and foremost was the issue of a place of refuge, of shelter, of safety from anti-Semitism. Herzl was deathly afraid that the ground was burning under the feet of the Jews of Europe, and as we know, unfortunately, he was right. He couldn't have imagined the Shoah that would follow. So he did also envision that that Jewish creativity would emerge, and innovation, and be the notion of a light unto the nations. That if the Jewish people were together, free in our own land, and this he describes in Alt Neuland, which is very interesting. If anyone hasn't read it, I'd recommend it. This new society, which would bring a new vision and be able to, through Jewish values, help the future for all people. So it similar to what you said, but not exactly. But he did believe that the Jewish nation deserved and should have our own home, because that's where we can be free and Jewish creativity would be unleashed.
Ron, please unmute yourself. Ron, are you? You need to unmute yourself. There he goes.
Hear me?
Yep.
By the way, my grandmother, as a young girl, met Herzl in Budapest,
Wow.
which my dad told me about. Yeah. Anyhow, you basically answered my question with Leon. I just want to know very quickly, did he ever discuss Zionism with people like Pinsker as well?
No, I don't know. I don't know when Pinsker died. I think his book was written in 1871. So I'm not aware of them having met. I have not read anything about them having met. Having said that, for the first Zionist Congress, he and I guess a small committee sought out people who would be partial to the issue of Zionism to come. So it may not have been him. I'm not aware that Pinsker himself went to any Zionist Congress. I don't know if he was alive in 1897. But Herzl certainly sought out anyone who might be partial to his idea. So if it wasn't Pinsker, involved, Jabotinsky was involved in the Zionist movement from a different perspective. Martin Buber, Achad Ha'am, they didn't see eye to eye, but everyone was invited. It was as chaotic as the Knesset was 2 days ago. I'm sure the Zionist Congress has had its own chaotic moments too, because people were. There was uniformity of a desire for the betterment of the Jewish people. There wasn't a uniformity of how to do that or what it would look like.
Okay, look, we have come up to time. Sorry to Saul and Philippa. We like to finish promptly. David, you've obviously got a passion for the subject. And if ever there was, the term that came to my mind was a calling. I imagine you feel a calling to become a representative of Herzl, and that's come through tonight. And I want to thank you very, very much from all of us. Thank you for getting up at 6 a.m. in the morning. It's been a pleasure to have you. Yes, the coffee mug's full, and we've thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you so much, and may you go from strength to strength.
Thank you for including me, and everyone be well, be safe.
Yeah, and I'll mention I've put your links up in the chat a few times so people can go and have a look at it if they want to. I'll hand over to David just to do a little bit of the wrap up, and then we'll say good night. David, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Does that work now? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, David, for a most fascinating explanation of the vision of Herzl and how it came into being. Last thing to do today is to foreshadow next week, which Alan and I are actually off to Canberra. We have a series of meetings with politicians and political staff, and we'll also be playing a role in a rally that's being organised by the Tibetan community, the Uyghur community, Hong Kong expats, concerning the suppression of human rights by the Chinese Communist Party. And as some of you know, we've reflected on the theme of never again. And we feel it's important to stand up for human rights if the lesson of the Holocaust is to mean anything. So we will be participating actively middle of next week in a rally in Canberra as well. So there won't be the usual sort of Zoom event. And finally, as we always do, if you're not yet actively supporting AJA, please join our email list via the website jewishassociation.org.au. Like and follow the AJA Facebook page, which contains the most up-to-date news and views items. And of course, we need tangible support. So if you're not yet a member, do apply for membership online and or make a donation. Well, thank you very much. Great event again.
Okay, thanks, David, and thanks, David in Canada. It's now just after 7 o'clock in the morning, so you've got your whole day to work through, David. So thank you to you. Thanks to everybody. You all make these sessions really enjoyable. So we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. We've got some great guests lined up. So until then, I'll wish you all a very good evening. Bye for now.